When the Higashikuni cabinet decided to resign en masse, Nadia Jinkido Koichi and Privy Council President Hiranuma Kijūrō began the search for a successor to the prime minister. These are the conditions listed for the next successor to prime minister. Someone who is not resentful towards America. A man who is not suspected of being a war criminal. Someone who is knowledgeable in diplomacy. These are the 3 conditions necessary for the next successor to prime minister. The name that was mentioned as meeting these 3 conditions was Shidehara Kijūrō. Shidehara Kijūrō had a track record of leading cooperative diplomacy with Britain and the United States before the war. However, since he was out of the political spotlight during the war, he had no need to worry about being held responsible for the war. So it was judged that he could gain the trust of the United States. However, Shidehara Kijūrō initially declined the request, saying, "I am already too old." Afterwards, after receiving strong persuasion from the Emperor of Japan, he decided that this would be his final act of service to the Emperor and accepted the position of Prime Minister. The Shidehara cabinet was formed.
我が国民が当面にいたしておりまする現下の事態は、誠に歴史上未曾有の国難であります。食料その他民生問題の対策、財政問題の処理、行政制度の改革、教育の刷新等、国民の心配しておる問題は山積しておるのであります。
The new Prime Minister, Shidehara Kijūrō, visits MacArthur to congratulate him on his new appointment. When MacArthur first came to Japan, he set out a policy of demilitarizing and democratization Japan. By this time, the dissolution of the Japanese military had already been completed, and demilitarization had been nearly achieved. The next issue that was identified for Japan to tackle was democratization. During his meeting with Shidehara Kijūrō, MacArthur presented him with 2 measures to achieve democratization. These were the liberalization of the Constitution and the 5 major reforms. Japan pursued 2 of the measures proposed by MacArthur. These policies were pursued in parallel. The 5 major reforms can be divided into 5 areas: the liberation of women, the encouragement of labor unionization, the liberalization of education, the abolition of the secret police, and the democratization of the economy. However, when we look at history chronologically, the topics are scattered and difficult to understand. For example, the topic sometimes shifted from constitutional liberalization to women's liberation or economic democratization. It then changed to the subject of constitutional liberalization and then back to the subject of women's emancipation. If I were to explain it chronologically, you might get confused. So to avoid confusion, I will break my talk down into topics. First, I will explain women's liberation in chronological order. Next, I will explain the cases of trade union formation, the liberalization of education, and the abolition of the secret police. Finally, I will talk about economic democratization in chronological order. Due to the structure of this commentary, some of the reforms I will introduce were implemented after Shidehara was in power. Please keep that in mind when listening to the explanation. Now, when you hear the phrase democratization by GHQ, you might imagine that Japan promoted democratization under instructions from GHQ. However, that is not necessarily true. This was because GHQ at the time had only just completed demilitarization and was not yet ready for democratization. Furthermore, conflict was emerging between the US government and MacArthur at the time. The US government told MacArthur, "The occupying forces are tools of policy, not policymakers. Do not act on your own, the government will give you instructions." However, MacArthur sometimes ignored the instructions of the US government and made decisions based on his own judgment. Due to this situation in the United States, some reforms were carried out in a form proposed by the Japanese side before receiving instructions from the occupying forces. In other words, Japan's democratization took 3 forms, one led by the Japanese government, one led by GHQ, and one achieved through a joint effort between the Japanese government and GHQ. Democratization in Japan took many different forms. Let's take a look at the specific changes that have taken place. The first of the 5 major reforms is the emancipation of women. Until now, only men had the right to vote in Japan. Women did not. The purpose of this reform was to change the situation by granting women the right to vote and thus liberating them socially. The movement to give women the right to vote began as early as the Taisho era. During the war, women's social status had already improved significantly as they went to work to replace men who had gone off to war. Regardless of GHQ's warnings, women's liberation was on track to be realized sooner or later. The Japanese government took the initiative in amending the House of Representatives Election Act. This amendment gave women the right to vote and lowered the age limit for both men and women from 25 to 20. The right to vote was given to men and women over the age of 25. The second of the 5 major reforms is encouraging the formation of labor unions. Until now in Japan, workers' wages have been kept low and they have not been able to buy enough things. As a result, the domestic market has become extremely small. In this situation, it becomes difficult for companies to expand profits within Japan, and they naturally begin to look for new opportunities overseas. GHQ believed that this social structure was the basis for foreign aggression such as the Mukden incident in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Changing this structure will not be easy. At that time in Japan, the power of managers and capitalists was overwhelming, and individual workers were unable to negotiate for things like pay raises. At that time, salaries were often set by management, and the structure of working for low wages was firmly established. GHQ tried to create a system that would allow workers to negotiate as a unit, rather than as individuals. GHQ encouraged the formation of labor unions in order to give workers power. GHQ sought to support the formation of labor unions by guaranteeing workers the right to organize, the right to negotiate as a group, and the right to strike as a group. The movement to enact labor union laws in Japan had already begun after World War I. The bill passed the House of Representatives, but was scrapped in the House of Peers before deliberations could be completed. The bureaucrats who had been working on labor issues continued to study labor issues in Europe and the United States and consider introducing them to Japan. At that time, the status of workers who were responsible for production during the war also improved. Due to these circumstances, it seemed likely that the formation of a labor union would come about sooner or later. The Japanese government began to move forward with reforms on its own accord, without waiting for instructions from GHQ. Japan created a labor union law that guarantees workers' right to organize, bargain collectively, and act collectively. As labor unions began to be formed, it became necessary to determine rules for when strikes and other disputes arose. The government established an institution called the Labor Relations Commission to act as a mediator between employees and management in the event of a labor dispute. These provisions are set out in the Labor Relations Adjustment Act. Based on the idea that minimum working conditions for workers should be protected, the law detailed workers' rights, including the principle of an 8-hour workday, improvements to working conditions, and protection of female workers. This is the Labor Standards Act. This resulted in the establishment of 3 labor laws: the Labor Union Law, the Labor Relations Adjustment Law, and the Labor Standards Law. The status of workers, who had been completely powerless before the war, was greatly compensated. As legal systems improved, labor unions began to be formed in government agencies and private companies, and Japan's labor movement made great strides. As for civil servants, their basic labor rights will be restricted in the future, but I will talk about that on another occasion. The third of the 5 major reforms is the liberalization of education. Until now, education has been used as a tool for thought control in Japan. In a subject called moral education, which is similar to modern-day morality, students were taught that sacrificing one's life for one's country was a virtue. In history class we were taught that Japan is a divine nation and the Emperor of Japan is our Hidogami. Geography classes included content justifying territorial expansion, such as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. GHQ believed that the Japanese education system at the time played a major role in shaping Japan's militaristic mentality, and so it carried out reforms with the aim of banning these practices. GHQ removed inappropriate statements from textbooks and discontinued classes in moral education, Japanese history, and geography. GHQ created a prerequisite for reform by expelling militaristic teaching staff. After that, a group of educational facilities from the United States came to Japan and full-scale educational reform was undertaken. The fundamental law of education was enacted, declaring that Japanese education exists not for the nation, but for the happiness of each individual and for society. The School Education Act was enacted, which defines specific school structures and systems based on the principles of the fundamental law of education. This reform extended Japan's compulsory education from 6 years of elementary school to 9 years, consisting of 6 years of elementary school and 3 years of junior high school. A new school system was proposed under which high school would be a 3-year program and university would be a 4-year program. This is how the foundations of modern school education were laid. The fourth of the 5 major reforms was the abolition of the secret police. Until now, Japan has had an organization called the Special Hire Police, commonly known as Special Hire Police, located throughout the country. The Special Hire Police cracked down thoroughly on communists, socialists, and even people who made critical remarks about the government. At that time, freedom of speech and thought was almost non-existent. For GHQ, which aimed for democratization, this kind of society was completely unacceptable. The foundation of democracy is the freedom of citizens to speak their minds. Repeal laws that impede freedom of speech, assembly and association. Based on this idea, GHQ ordered the abolition of the secret police. The secret police was abolished, and citizens were able to freely engage in political activities. The fifth of the 5 major reforms is the democratization of the economy. Until now in Japan, the landlord class and zaibatsu have monopolized wealth and power, and the people they ruled were forced to live in poverty. GHQ focused on this economic inequality and domination structure and believed that this structure was the cause of militarism and aggressive wars. GHQ aimed to transform this economic inequality and domination structure into a democratic one. GHQ implemented land reform to solve the landlord problem, and carried out the dissolution of zaibatsu to solve the zaibatsu problem. Please watch in order. This is about land reform. Until now in Japan, people who owned large tracts of land, known as landlords, would rent out the land to landless tenant farmer, known as tenant farmers, to grow rice and vegetables. Tenant farmer had to pay a large portion of their harvest to the landlord as land use rent. The system was set up so that landowners could receive money without having to work themselves. No matter how hard the tenant farmer worked, their lives remained difficult. This system, in which landlords appear to be parasitic on poor farmers, is called absentee landlordism. The Japanese government was concerned about the situation. When rural areas become exhausted, the peasants' morale deteriorates. We must prevent rural areas from becoming impoverished. The position of tenant farmer must be improved. Based on this idea, the government saw the changes resulting from the defeat as an opportunity for reform and prepared a land reform plan. Under the land reform, the government purchased all land from absentee landlords who owned farmland but did not live in the village or engage in farming. These are local landlords who live in the village and also farm. The government was forced to purchase from local landowners any land they owned that exceeded 5 chobu, an area larger than a single Tokyo dome. In the past, it was common to pay for sharecropping with crops such as white rice. This placed a heavy burden on farmers, as they had to pay a set amount regardless of whether the harvest was good or bad. The land reform decided to have a system whereby payment would be made in money. Land reform lightened the burden on peasants somewhat and weakened the power of landlords. The land reform bill met with strong opposition from lawmakers with rural bases, and it became apparent that it would never pass the House of Representatives. The land reform plan was implemented with the backing of GHQ, but the content of the first land reform was insufficient. GHQ urged the Japanese government to implement even stronger reforms, and the second land reform was implemented. As a result of the second land reform, the amount of land that local landowners could own was severely restricted from 5 chobu to 1 chobu. Any land exceeding this amount was forcibly purchased by the government and sold cheaply to tenant farmer. The second land reform produced great results, liberating 83% of all tenanted land. The absentee landlordism that had continued since the Meiji era has completely collapsed. I would like to talk about another part of economic democratization, the dissolution of zaibatsu. Until now, Japan has had huge corporate groups such as Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Yasuda that have dominated the Japanese economy since the Meiji era. This is the zaibatsu. Because these zaibatsu own many banks and factories, the Japanese economy was structured in such a way that too much power was concentrated in the hands of a few zaibatsu. The zaibatsu were also a source of funding for political parties, so they tried to sway politics in a way that was advantageous to them. Seeing this situation, GHQ decided that in order to democratization Japan, we must dismantle these zaibatsu, and carried out the dissolution of zaibatsu. GHQ instructed the Japanese government to establish the Holding Company Liquidation Commission. The Holding Company Liquidation Commission will be responsible for taking over the large amounts of shares held by the zaibatsu. The Holding Company Liquidation Commission sold the shares it acquired in the following order: employees, the area surrounding the factory, residents, and the general public. This led to a rapid increase in the number of individuals holding company shares, the collapse of corporate control by the zaibatsu, and a movement toward the realization of a free market economy. GHQ felt that simply dissolution of zaibatsu was not enough. If another company comes along and gains too much power, the same thing will happen again. GHQ promulgated the Anti-Monopoly Act and the Act on the Act for Elimination of Excessive Concentration of Economic Power. Anti-Monopoly Act prevent companies from monopolizing the market. The Act for Elimination of Excessive Concentration of Economic Power made companies that were too large subject to breakup. After the war, Japan made great strides towards democratization, including economic growth,